Wushuwunoag. Natawag mga kakanitampag. Wushuwunoag. It's great to be here with you all this evening. Neesu, Wushuwunoag, Director General, Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. So blessed as always to be back with you to share another few thoughts. And I think that this is a good discussion tonight. And it's just talking about the basic elements that kind of substantiate any claim when you're talking indigenous heritage, particularly here in the U.S., what is now known as the U.S., and those elements being tradition, culture, and heritage. And I know that these words kind of get thrown around, I think, in everyday conversation, but they also do have legal aspects and ramifications and understandings. And it's always good to understand that aspect of it, because that's what's most problematic for most tribal nations that are dealing with colonization and individuals who have been impacted by colonization. So looking at tradition, culture, and heritage, and ultimately how they substantiate any claim that is made, be it by the nation, be it by you as a citizen of your nation, whatever the case may be. These are three elements that are kind of key and foundational, and it's good to have an understanding of them. So let's get started. The first is this term tradition. And tradition is very important. We'll see. I'm going to read the definition. This is coming from Black's Law, 2nd edition. If you just Google tradition, Black's Law, it should come up and you can find this there. And this is the definition it has. It says, in the rule respecting the admission of tradition or general reputation to prove boundaries, questions of pedigree, etc. Now, we're going to come back to that in a moment, pedigree, but keep that in mind. So, in the rule respecting the admission of tradition or general reputation to prove boundaries, questions of pedigree, etc. This would mean knowledge or belief derived from the statements or declarations of contemporary witnesses, so witnesses at the time of, who saw what was going on and had knowledge or beliefs about what was going on, contemporary witnesses, and handed down orally through a considerable period of time. So the people at that time, what were they saying, and how long has that been passed down through time? So that's your tradition. The people, what they were saying at the time, the contemporary people who were there and what they were writing and what they were saying, and that being passed down through time. That's tradition. But it's also, remember initially I said hold on to this, it's also used in terms of proving boundaries, reputation-wise, and also questions of pedigree. Now, what is pedigree? Well, pedigree is lineage, your line of ancestors from which a person descends. Genealogy. So when we impress upon you the importance of having your genealogy down, you can clearly see why pedigree is another way, another term of art for your I don't necessarily know if it's a term of art. Could be. Yeah, it could be. Pedigree is another term of art for genealogy. And genealogy, questions of genealogy, are a key element in substantiating your tradition. So lineage, line of ancestors from which one descends, genealogy, an account or register of a line of ancestors, family relationship. So your genealogy is a key element of your tradition. And your tradition is going to be established by what you say and what was being said about your people at the time with contemporary witnesses there, and how that was passed down through time. So your tradition is going to go back. It has to connect back. And the further back, the more they were saying the same thing, the more valid your tradition is going to be, what you hold to know as the truth. And that ties directly in with your pedigree or your genealogy. So foundational is genealogy. Tradition is based in genealogy because your genealogy substantiates whatever stories that you're telling. If I know who your family is, then I probably know a little bit about where you come from and what your backgrounds are. So when you come and tell me things that line up with what I know to be about your family, then, oh, okay, yeah, sounds correct. Now, on the same token, if I know your family and you come and tell me things that I know have nothing to do with your family, well, hold on a second. What's going on here? He doesn't quite understand what the tradition is for his people. So that's one key element, tradition. And remember, pedigree is a key component of tradition. So let's look at a second element, and this is culture. And this is going to be actually legal culture. I'm going to get these next two definitions from a website called definitions.uslegal.com. The first one I looked up was legal culture because regular culture wasn't popping up. And it gave two definitions, but the one that is most appropriate for what we're discussing tonight is the second one, and it's all in one paragraph, but it's the second half of the paragraph. Legal culture may also refer to the idea, values, attitudes, and opinions people in some society hold with regard to law and the legal system. So your culture is how you engage or view your legal system and the law. What is your relationship with the law? What is the law's relationship with you? What is your own mode of governance and how you keep things intact and in order? This is where, once again, the tribal aspect comes in. Because if you don't have any culture specifically that you're pointing to, then it is assumed that you are under American culture. So you have to, there has to be a relationship with some other tribal nation that predates. And as you can see, this terminology of legal culture is really about what that nation, that tribal nation, what is their opinions, attitudes, values, and ideas in regards to the law and the legal system. And as we know here in the U.S., especially under the Constitution, Indian tribes, their commerce is regulated by Congress. And there's also this status of Indians not taxed, which we discussed in a previous video, which only comes through the relationship with the tribal nation because the Indian not tax status was defined as Indians who were still under tribal rule and had not relinquished it. So if you're not in some sort of formal relationship with your tribe and some sort of formal relationship with them in terms of citizenship, then you are considered to have relinquished tribal rule and to be under U.S. jurisdiction as a U.S. citizen. So the nation is really what is defining the culture and also the tradition. And also the tradition that we just discussed. Even though tradition is a little bit more specific to the individual because of pedigree, but once again, your pedigree should tie you back to a particular nation. So then you can point to the culture that is yours. And you can say, well, that's not how my people do things. We don't have a president. We have a principal chief. We have a grand sachem. We have a pumham. We have a massasoit. We have a Powhatan. We have all of these titles that were around and that are still intact, just not utilized. So your nation, your tradition is going to lead you to your culture, which is tied to your nation. And under that, then you can enforce cultural rights law. And cultural rights are the rights that are vested in groups of people in relation to their art and culture. And remember, once again, that culture is the viewing of the law, how they engage with it. So what is your nation's mode of doing things, of governance? Like I said, how does your nation keep things in order? And you're not going to be able to argue that you're your own nation where you're at. There are nations that predate you in the very lands where you stand. Are you connected with that nation? And if you're not connected with that nation, then you can't enforce any of their rights in their lands. So it's important to know which nation, because then you know your culture, and then you can also know your culture in relations to other cultures with people who have different traditions than you. But cultural rights, they're rights that are vested in groups of people in relation to their art and culture. It means the right to preserve and develop one's cultural identity, as well as the right to protect endangered cultures. And once again, if you don't know what your culture is, if you haven't defined it specifically through your tradition, then you can't, what cultural rights can you argue? Generic ones? Because each nation is different. Up here in the Northeast, a lot of us are wampum people. You go to different areas of the country, they don't do wampum. Wampum was a show of respect. Wampum was a show of, I don't want to necessarily say authority, but presence. You know, you didn't need a lot of wampum, but if a particular individual had a lot, you assume that there was something, you know, strong about them. Something commendable, something honorable. So wampum was that for my people. And a lot of the tribes up in the Northeast, that's not necessarily the same thing in other places. So what is your culture and how does that apply? And cultural rights are how you defend them. Cultural rights are human rights that guarantee people and communities the freedom to access and participate in the culture of their choice. And cultural rights mainly aim at ensuring enjoyment of a culture and its components in conditions of equality, human dignity, and non-discrimination. But once again, how will you know what your culture is if you don't know what your tradition is? And your tradition is founded in your pedigree, your genealogy. So as you go through this step, as you're looking at reclassification in whatever form or function that may be it the census, be it whatever the case may be, your genealogy is foundational, because without your pedigree, how do you argue your tradition? There will be questions about your pedigree. Well, who are your people? You're saying this, but how do I know that? And you can't argue, well, you can't tell me, because they're not telling you, they're asking you. They're asking you to tell them. And if you can't tell them, then it's an unsubstantiated claim. So you need your pedigree, your genealogy, to establish your tradition. And your tradition would take you then to your culture, which is going to be based off of your nation, because your nation sets up its laws. Your nation has is what you're deferring to, rather than the U.S. The U.S. has its constitution. You're pointing to their constitution and saying, that's what you wrote about me. But what you're really saying is, I'm under a different set of laws, and those laws come from your nation. So that's your culture, your legal culture, and cultural rights law. Once again, that's at definitions.uslegal.com. And then the last element I'll discuss tonight is, after you've got your tradition, right, your pedigree and all that, proving your boundaries, after you've got your culture, this is our separate jurisdiction, separate law, separate nation, based upon our tradition, our blood lines and family lineage and all of that. Now you can have conversations about heritage. And what is heritage? Well, this is back to Black's Law, 2nd edition. Heritage is every species of immovable which can be the subject of property, such as lands, houses, orchards, woods, marshes, ponds, etc. So your heritage, all of those things, the lands that we talk about, it's all going to be based and connected to your tradition and your culture. And if you don't know specifically where you're coming from, you can't make the claims, because no one's telling you anything. You're making a claim and they're asking you to substantiate it. So when I say I'm not against it, I can point to family members that are enrolled with the federal tribe. I can point to grandfathers that were chiefs, uncles that were medicine men. I can show documented history of me always being in these lands, and my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother. All of these things show my pedigree, who I am. And that is passed down. When you ask around, they'll tell you, yeah, the Michaels are Indians, the Champlins are Indians. And then it passed down, the Johnsons and the Watsons are Indians. You know, So those are all part of the tradition that is passed down over years, and the Michaels and the Champlins come from Canonicus, Mayantonomi, and you know, and the same thing can be said with other tribal nations. The tradition is there. Because the tradition is there, we can say our culture is Nahigansett. This is how Nahigansett did it. This is how Pokanoket did it. This is how, based off of our blood lineage and our pedigrees, who we are, who it is known that we are, regardless of what you've been writing since. Because if you look before that, remember, it's passed down over long periods of time. So for 200 years, my people are known, or your people are known as Indians. Well, why are we switching it up the last 100 years? That's not how it was being carried down. You see what you see the point? So all of that is what substantiates any claims to heritage. And once again, heritage is every species of immovable which can be the subject of property such as lands, houses, orchards, woods, marshes, ponds, etc., in whatever mode they may have been acquired, either by descent or purchase. By descent or purchase. So you can have them in two ways. By descent, they were descended down to you, or by purchase. But once again, how can you claim descent if you don't know who you descend from and what they were entitled to? Everyone's not entitled to lands here in what they now call Rhode Island. I'm not entitled to all lands here in Rhode Island. There were different tribes underneath the Nahigansett Nation. Pokanoket was a nation. Pokanoket was also a tribe. It's like New York, New York. Pokanoket, Pokanoket. There were Wabaquasit, Nipmucks. There were all of these different tribes underneath these nations, and they had different jurisdictions. Different jurisdictions. Whatever the case may be, this is all founded specifically in your individual pedigree. Your individual pedigree is going to substantiate your tradition, what's said about you, what the proper record is, not what they misclassified us as, but what the proper record is. What your own people's oral tradition says, what the record said prior to foolishness, what the history says, all of that. What does tradition say about who you are, and your pedigree is a key element of that. Once you get your tradition, you're now onto your culture, which is going to be nation-based, because it is the ideas, values, attitudes, and opinions people in a society hold. So it's a collective thing. It's not you by yourself. It's your nation. Your nation as a whole. How did they conduct themselves? And this is the trouble of new tribes, because new tribes don't have any culture. Most likely they're going off of an American culture. Or else they're trying to take pieces from an older culture that's there. But then if that's the case, then you should be going by that culture in its entirety, not trying to create something new. Something new, you're going to be doing it as a U.S. citizen, most likely. And if you're doing it as a U.S. citizen, you don't have right to create your own laws. You're subject to the U.S. and the laws that it has. What you've done is just reclassify yourself, but you're still subject. And once you get your culture down based upon the nation, you can enforce cultural rights laws, which give you the right for your culture to grow and to be. To grow and to be. So you have your tradition based in your pedigree, which leads to your culture based in your cultural rights based in your nation, and substantiated in your nation, which then leads to conversations about heritage, which is every species of immovable, which can be the subject of property such as lands, houses, orchards, woods, marshes, ponds, etc., in whatever mode they may have been acquired, either by descent or purchase. So by descent or purchase, either they purchased it, and in most cases they didn't, or you have it by descent. And that descent means genealogy, pedigree, specific bloodlines, away from the generic Aboriginal stuff, because there was no families named Aboriginal that have any land claims anywhere. That's a generic term. Who are your bloodlines and from where? Now, it doesn't mean you can't do great things where you're at, but if you're talking Indian, then this is the way that it has to go. And this is why these things are so important. That's why you see what they call, what I refer to as traditional Indians, so stringent upon the way that the culture is supposed to be, because that's what provides the protection. That's what creates the relationship with everything that's around us. The heritage, the trees, the sky, by presenting our culture, the way we do things, the way things were done, the way things were passed down through tradition for generations, and playing out in the culture. That's what ties us to the heritage. When you do something new, you remove that connection to the heritage. When you want to do the old, but the old mixed with the new, then it's not the old anymore. It's a different culture, and a different culture falls under a different nation because it's not your traditional nation. Therefore, it must be something quote unquote American, which means you're under American law and you have the right based upon heritage through American law. And what do your people have through on the American side of things? So, something to think about. It's so key. Once you get onto this other side of the fence, into the Indian realm, understand there's traditions, there's culture, and their heritage, and they're very much alive right now. You just may not be aware of them, but they're very, very, very much alive right now, and there's a set way of doing things. Take the time to learn, be humble, and seek out. If you do things with a humble spirit, you'd be surprised how far you get. When you come with this entitlement and this anger, and you people did this and I'm supposed to have that, amongst Indian folk, that don't go far. I don't care if you want to call them Negroid, Mongoloid, Caucasoid, all these stupid labels that they put on the stupid label of an Indian. Whatever the case may be, I don't know any Indian really that you can approach like that and expect them to help, myself included, or any other member nations here at FANA. So just wanted to share that, just some thoughts. Tradition, culture, and heritage. Once again, your pedigree is so important. Your genealogy, who you actually are, that ties you to your traditions, which lead to your culture, which is based in your nation. Your nation, this quote-unquote society, your groupings of people, how you've all decided to conduct yourselves together and have agreed to do that. That's what your constitution, with your nation and all that. That's your culture. And you can enforce your cultural rights, and part of your cultural rights, of course, connects right to your heritage based upon your tradition, which is established through your pedigree. Hope that makes sense. Hope this was informative, and just hoping that these words that I share are of some benefit as you continue forth on your own path to self-discovery. Wushuwunoag. Kapishkanash. Have a great evening, and I hope to see you all soon. I hope.